Hello and welcome to Changing What's Possible, the Disability Innovation Podcast brought to you by the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and this season we are excited to bring you remarkable stories of life-changing technology. Today we have with us Sam van Bohemen, co-founder, CEO, and CTO of the company Nuroflux. And Sam is going to tell us more about the wearable system they have developed that provides continuous quantitative monitoring for blood flow and activity in the brain, designed for people to use after stroke. And in the second half of our episode today, we are going to hear from David Smith, who's going to share his insights and experiences surrounding his stroke and his recovery. So listeners, let's get started today. Sam, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Mary, for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us. Can you start by telling us a little bit more about the company Nuroflux and your role there?
Nuroflux was actually founded from a PhD I'm currently completing in biomedical engineering, where I've developed a new technology for the continuous monitoring of changes in brain blood flow or cerebral blood flow. And now at Nuroflux, we're commercializing this technology to develop a device for the continuous monitoring of both brain activity and blood flow in stroke patients.
Fantastic. And I think as part of a PhD, most people don't form new companies. So can you tell us a little bit more about how Nuroflux got started and maybe why?
You're right. I knew that we were developing this technology and it had potential to be commercialized. So I went through 2 accelerator programs now to really explore the commercial potential and what's involved with commercializing a new technology. And yeah, I was really excited by the opportunity. So I took it with both hands and here we are today.
Fantastic. So did you know maybe when you were enrolling in your PhD program that you had this interest in entrepreneurship or that you wanted to be part of a startup company?
Absolutely. I wanted to be involved in the industry and I wanted to do research that had a tangible output. So I was very interested in commercializing and getting involved in the industry from day one.
Interesting. So what was it about this particular project that caught your attention and really captivated you?
I thought it was just a very interesting project. One of my supervisors, actually his father-in-law, had suffered multiple strokes in between CT scans in hospital about a year before my PhD started. And my supervisor had an idea for a new technology that could be used to monitor changes in brain blood flow in hospitals. So he had this idea and a hypothesis that he presented to me. And yeah, I took it with both hands, as I just said, and started investigating and developing the technology that we're now commercializing at Nuroflux.
So to give our listeners out there something to think about in terms of how things normally operate in the hospital following a stroke versus how things could potentially operate with the Nuroflux system, can you maybe give a view into how things are now and how things could be?
Absolutely. So ischemic stroke is the most common type of stroke. It's caused by a sudden restriction in brain blood flow. But following a suspected stroke, a patient will come to hospital where they'll have a CT scan to confirm the diagnosis. But CT scans provide an imaging snapshot in time, but due to radiation exposure, are only performed every 24 hours. And in this first 24-hour window in particular, patients will receive treatment, but are also at risk of patient deterioration, which can occur in up to 40% of patients with acute ischemic stroke. However, there's currently no way to provide continuous monitoring of both brain activity and brain blood flow during the CT scans. Standard care currently relies upon waiting for the next scan or on intensive nursing observations, which actually occur initially every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours, then every half an hour for the next 4 hours, then every hour for the next 4 hours, and every 4 hours after that. So as you can imagine, this is very intensive, very distressing for patients, can be very time-consuming for nurses. It's also subjective. And if a patient is sedated or unconscious, this method is ineffective. So we identified this gap, and with the technology that we've developed during my PhD, we're now commercializing this to develop this wearable device that patients will be able to wear in hospital in between CT scans to monitor treatment outcome and also detect patient deterioration faster than current methods, leading to better patient outcomes.
Definitely. And I think a lot of our listeners out there might be familiar about what a CT scan looks like. It's this large, kind of clunky, cumbersome piece of equipment. So can you describe what the Nuroflux system looks like?
You're right. The CT scans are these large machines, very expensive. The Nuroflux device is actually utilizing existing technologies in a novel way to provide the monitoring that I described previously. But the device is very lightweight, portable device, relatively cheap as well in terms of medical equipment. So we're really looking to provide, a cheap portable device that can be applied to stroke patients in hospitals. But there was also scope to use this device in pre-hospital environments, even at home. But also due to the low cost of the device, we're particularly interested in developing countries where the cost of a CT scan is actually so high that patients often do not have these scans. So because of the cheap, portable nature of the device, it could have broad applicability across many different areas of stroke.
Absolutely. And to help us visualize it, can you describe the actual hardware of the device?
Right now, the device has a fabric headband device that goes around the head with a number of electrodes placed across the scalp. And we also have 2 electrode leads to monitor the heart activity across the chest as well. So it's just a simple headband device that's pretty comfortable to wear.
Fantastic. So maybe to go into a little bit more of the nerdy details here, what does the Nuroflux system kind of do with all these different parts and how does it work?
So without going into too much detail, the technology we've developed monitors electrical signals produced by the body to infer changes in brain blood flow. This is the novel metric that I've developed during my PhD. So this is in terms of brain blood flow. But because the device utilizes electrodes placed across the scalp, which are referred to as electroencephalography or EEG, the monitoring of brain activity, our device can compute simultaneously our novel metric of blood flow with the traditional EEG measures of brain activity. And we hope to use both of these metrics in combination to increase sensitivity to stroke.
Interesting. So what is the importance of monitoring both blood flow in the brain and also the brain activity? I know a CT scan, if you're doing just a normal sort of perfusion CT, you would only be getting that blood flow information.
That's right. And a stroke is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, ischemic stroke anyways. Both strokes are a reduction in blood flow. Ischemic stroke is usually caused by a blood clot, whereas hemorrhagic stroke is the bleeding in the brain. But both of these ultimately result in reductions in blood flow to tissue in the brain, which causes neuronal death, which has knock-on effects in terms of brain activity. So both brain activity and brain blood flow are heavily implicated in stroke. So we hope to use both of these metrics, as described earlier, to increase sensitivity to stroke.
So Sam, can you tell us a little bit more about the monitoring capabilities of this system and what people actually see while someone's wearing it?
So we are still developing the user interface and what people will see and hear as the device is worn. But it could be something analogous to an ECG monitor that people are very familiar with in hospitals today. But that development of that part of the product will require some customer discovery and talking to doctors and patients to understand what's most suitable, but also what would be integrated into the hospital environment easily.
Absolutely. And this device has potential applications both in the hospital, but also at home. So do you anticipate maybe the home monitoring would be a phone app, a tablet? What are you thinking for that piece of it?
Definitely. I think in terms of the user interface and the screen that people would see could be quite different in those 2 applications. It's also important to note that the device is going to have algorithms to spit out metrics in real time, and we don't want nurses or doctors to have to go through and spend a long time analyzing what the metrics are finding. So it's ideally going to be a device that can just tell people something's happened or the patient is okay at the moment, nothing's going on, to allow easy interpretation and use.
Absolutely. And we mentioned that it is a continuous monitoring device. How long do people have to wear it to start getting useful information from it?
Yeah, that is a good question that I often get asked. And I think it also comes back to clinical trials that we have planned to conduct. I know the research shows that patient deterioration is most likely in the first few days following stroke. So in that instance, the first few days could be the most suitable time for the device. But, as I speak to people that have had strokes in the past, they would love to wear this device at home, maybe while they sleep or just when they're feeling a bit worried about maybe having another stroke. So the short answer is that more trials and research is required to really understand the duration of monitoring and use.
Certainly. So if people have one of these devices at home in the future, for example, would they just put it on for sort of a quick 10-minute check, or what would that look like?
You could do. Of course, in reality, as that stroke could appear at any time. So in theory, you put it on for 10 minutes, then it happens at the 11th minute. So again, research and more trials are required to understand that duration of monitoring and use.
Interesting. So can you talk a little bit about the impacts that Nuroflux is having, or maybe it has the potential to provide for users in the future?
Sure. So we are quite early in our journey. We have conducted a clinical safety study to show that the device is safe, feasible and acceptable in a small population of ischemic stroke patients here in Sydney. However, the device has potential to monitor patients in hospital in between CT scans to detect treatment outcome and detect patient deterioration. And we're actually currently gearing up for a new clinical trial to assess exactly that.
Interesting. So have you gotten any feedback from the people who've actually used the device in terms of how they perceived it? Was it comfortable? Was it something that they were excited to try?
Absolutely. So that was the purpose of the clinical safety study. We recruited 17 ischemic stroke patients and they wore the device for 9 hours each. And device comfort scores across all of those patients across the 9 hours was about 93%. So it was really high, showing that the device is really comfortable. And the patients were very tolerant of the device and willing to use it. And they all actually reported that they would be happy to wear this device at hospitals in the future. But more interestingly, they would also be interested to wear the device from the comfort of their home to detect future strokes as well.
And you mentioned that you're relatively early in the Nuroflux journey. Do you have a sense of when it might be commercially available or what these next steps are to get there?
It does take a long time to commercialize a new medical technology. There's lots of hurdles to go through, including clinical trials and regulatory approval. But we estimate that we can get to market by 2026.
And do you anticipate that you'll continue to work on the Nuroflux even after your PhD is completed?
That's right. So my PhD is due to end at the end of this year, but we're putting measures in place to allow me to continue Nuroflux full-time early next year. And as mentioned also, we have a clinical trial for Nuroflux starting early next year, hopefully. So I'll be working on that.
Fantastic. And I know our conversation thus far has really focused on the potential applications for stroke, because I think this monitoring, particularly continuous monitoring, is so important for strokes where you might get recurrent strokes afterwards. But there are some other potential applications as well. Can you touch on some of the other things that this system could potentially be useful for, other conditions or diseases?
Sure. Even in the context of stroke, there's a few areas that it could be applied. I mentioned pre-hospital, at home. There's also subtypes of stroke that it could be used as well. But in terms of other neurological disorders, we've spoken with many neurologists here in Australia, but also overseas, and they've highlighted neurological disorders, including traumatic brain injury, delirium, even migraines, where this technology could play a role.
Interesting. Are there any additional considerations or adjustments you'd have to make to the system for it to be used with these other types of conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think clinical trials and research should be required to understand those, but the form factor would most likely be very similar as the current device, but it would probably be tweaking of algorithms and understanding thresholds of our metrics that indicate other diseases aside from stroke.
And Sam, I have to ask, what are you most excited about in terms of the future of Nuroflux?
I think it's just the potential to help so many people. It's incredible what we could achieve if we were successful. Obviously, as I said, we're still early in our journey, but it's a very exciting opportunity, and I'm very privileged to have done this PhD and now be working on this exciting company. So, stroke is the second leading cause of death worldwide, and we have potential to impact many lives in the future.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to share about Nuroflux or your experience with it?
Yeah, if anyone wants to find any more information out or would like to talk to me about what we're doing, feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email. Happy to chat with them.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Sam on LinkedIn. Send him a message if you have any questions or if you want to learn more about Nuroflux. And Sam, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us on the show today. And listeners, stay with us. We'll be right back after this short message with more great content. Listeners, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far in this episode of Changing What's Possible, then there's another podcast we think you might like. Cerebral Conversations is created by Cerebral Palsy Alliance, an organization that works closely with CPARF. And this podcast is all about candid conversations exploring the biggest issues impacting people living with cerebral palsy and other disabilities. You can learn about early intervention, advocacy, research, inclusion, and more from experts and people with lived experience. Listen and subscribe to Cerebral Conversations on your favorite podcast platform and visit cerebralpalsy.org.au to learn more about the Cerebral Palsy Alliance. Welcome back, listeners, and I'm excited to introduce you all to our second guest today, David Smith. Listeners, David experienced a stroke a number of years ago before Nuroflux was created, and he's here to talk more about his experience and how he thinks Nuroflux could help others who experience a stroke in the future. So, hello, David, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we are excited to learn more about your experience and your thoughts on Nuroflux. So, can you start by telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your personal connection to stroke?
Yeah, so 5 years and 3 months ago, I had what's known as a subarachnoid hemorrhage, which I am one of the 13% of stroke sufferers that sits on the hemorrhage side. Most listeners would be familiar to people saying, oh, so-and-so had a brain aneurysm, but a hemorrhage is just a brain aneurysm bursting.
Absolutely. So what are some of the impacts that stroke had on your life? And maybe what did your rehabilitation and recovery look like?
So I was 36 years old at the time, so I really didn't fit into the archetype of a stroke sufferer. I was extremely lucky. So I had the hemorrhage and my wife picked it up pretty immediately, called an ambulance. We did what's called the FAST test with 000, which is the Australian version of 911. And sure enough, I could not move my face anymore. So rushed into an ambulance, taken straight to an emergency room. Through a neuro ward, I was explaining the sort of circumstances that happened on the way to the hemorrhage. And then they started exactly what Sam was covering earlier. A lot of race testing, which is squeeze my hand, lift your leg, that sort of thing. Firstly, 15 minutes, then per hour, then every 4 hours. I had a CT scan, MRIs, and about 2 days into my recovery, I guess you could say, they found another burst aneurysm in my head.
Oh, wow.
So we then spent 5 months trying to find a way to get to it. It wasn't a standard one that you could coil. And I ended up having an interventional radiologist from Prince of Wales Private Hospital doing a stent. They go up through your femoral artery and latch the stent in.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the maybe stress surrounding a stroke is sort of this big scary event happens once, but then there's sort of that looming fear that they could find something else in these scans that you're getting. So what was that waiting experience like for you?
My wife and I always tell this story where I think we were sort of saying that, okay, I think we might have beat this. I think we might be through. And then we actually overheard a nurse organizing a transfer for me. And she would say, patient Smith found a second aneurysm, transferred to Prince of Wales. So I didn't even have a doctor tell me. I overheard it from a nurse who was just trying to get something done.
Oh, no.
Going to the psychological, I wrote my will. It was simple. Get me a pen and paper. These are the accounts. This is where all the money is. I thought that was the end, to be honest. And they ended up deciding not to go in that day because they would have clicked it and it wouldn't have worked and it would have been extremely risky. And instead, we played a little game of working out a way to actually get to it.
Absolutely. And I think being in the hospital is a stressful experience as well. And not having that continuous information can be really frustrating because you just want to know what's going on. So how did you find out about Nuroflux, this continuous monitoring system?
So I actually work in startups at the University of Sydney, and Sam came in and gave a talk to one of the student societies. And as he was talking, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense because the absolute worst part of having a stroke is sitting there in the neuro ward. It's that uncertainty. It's just there's chaos around you. You move from ED and you think it's going to get better, but it actually gets a lot worse because neuro wards are people at their worst. And as Sam was telling his story, I'm like, oh my Lord, I could have used you 5 years ago.
Absolutely. So for your own stroke specifically, did you have particular impairments afterwards? Did it affect your motor, your speech, your cognition?
Yeah, I do slur some words sometimes. My left arm, I probably have about 60% use. But I think the main one is the sort of psychological. It is a huge burden, especially I was young. I was 36. I had a 3-year-old. My wife obviously just became the breadwinner because I couldn't work. There was a lot of that sort of psychological issue.
Absolutely. So let's maybe fast forward in your memory. If Nuroflux had been available, how do you think your experience would have been different?
I would have got me out of that neuro ward so much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was a price I wouldn't have paid to be able to wear something around my head that I could just take home and just know that I had that peace of mind that nothing was happening. And the other thing it would have done is my wife was constantly there, but my parents were actually overseas when this happened. So they were trying to get flights back and everything else. And when you have something like this, people want to call and check, but they don't want to call too much. If I had something like a Nuroflux, I could just send out a group text to my sisters, my brother, my parents. 2 hours, still everything fine. It would have just eliminated so much of the psychological burden and plus the burden of not having to have somebody around me all the time. If something flashed up on the Nuroflux, I could just call an ambulance. Whereas there's always the worry that if you're by yourself, you won't have the capacity or you'll get to it too late.
That makes sense. And in terms of the monitoring capacity, David, can you tell us a little bit more about what you would want to see in a system like Nuroflux in terms of what it would be telling you?
I don't know much about the product as such, but it's one of those ones where I would like to see nothing. I would just like to put it on my head and just know it's there. Just know that it's monitoring and everything else. It's kind of like when you do an ECG in the hospital, that noise telling you nothing's wrong is actually kind of soothing. And that's what it would be for me.
Yeah. Once it starts beeping, everyone starts panicking, right?
Exactly. So I would love something that is just constantly telling me you're doing okay.
Perfect. So can you talk a little bit more about, I guess, the benefits that you see Nuroflux providing patients, but also their families? You touched on this a little bit.
The families, it's unbelievable. I sort of flip it around on time now. So I'm in my early 40s. My dad's in his late 60s. If my dad was to have a stroke now, I would put a Nuroflux on his head. I would be leveraging my relationship with Sam to get one there because it would just give me that peace of mind. It would just give me that ability to monitor without being intrusive. And it would just allow me to get on with my day knowing that something was monitoring and pass every so often turning up to a doctor's office and doing that race test. This is much more advanced, much more peace of mind. It would make me feel a lot better.
Absolutely. And as we've talked about during our conversation today, there's sort of these two different ways to use the device. There's this in-hospital monitoring that clinicians would be kind of keeping track of all your information, but also this at-home monitoring where you could keep tabs on how things are looking for yourself and maybe give updates to friends and family. So is this something, this at-home monitoring, something that you think you would be interested in to detect future strokes?
I would pay any price to be able to just put it on my head occasionally and just make sure that nothing's wrong. Even 5 years down the line, every time I get a headache, I wonder if this is it, if this is the next one. So just to have something that I could just put on my head, just get that relaxation and peace of mind and just move forward.
Well, for people out there who are interested in learning more about Nuroflux or maybe interested in trying it once it becomes available, do you have any message that you'd like to give them?
With all things like research commercialization and everything else, we need to support early and often. We need to open up our networks, whether it be the doctors, whether it be funding, anything we can do to get this closer to market, because I think it has a huge mass market application.
Well, David, we appreciate you joining us today and sharing your insights. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And listeners, it's been great to have you here with us as well. When you have a moment, please subscribe and leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know what you think of the show. And we look forward to connecting with you again in our next episode of Changing What's Possible.